Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the International Conference Another Art World. My name is Milan Đorđević. I'm a visual artist and a PhD candidate in the field of culture and media management, currently acting as co-chair of this conference. Yesterday, within a keynote lecture with Professor Alexander, we spoke about the neoliberal transformation of cultural policy, which is more or less a case with all European countries. And today's program, we will start by observing the relationship between neoliberalism and authoritarianism as one of the key points of the conference. Many theorists, as well as practitioners, consider that the situation of the global concentration of wealth and power is a consequence of neoliberal policies, which makes a belief on culture and arts as an exclusive rights in society, where in contrast to direct participation and joint decision-making, all means and decision-making power are assigned to elites and professionals who are elected on the principle of representative democracy. So I would like to introduce our first keynote speaker for today, Professor Gabrielle Mihalich, who is an Austrian political scientist and economist, professor at the University of Vienna and the University of Klagenfurt, especially interested in neoliberalism, authoritarianism, and gender, feminist political economy as well. She was a chairperson of the expertise group for the Council of Europe on gender budgeting, and she served as associate and guest lecturer on universities in China, Hungary, Mexico, and Turkey. Her contribution today refers to the theoretical foundations, the guiding principles, and the political strategies of neoliberalism from a political economic perspective in order to analyze the driving forces of these changes and their implications as essential aspects of broad democratization and growing authoritarianism in Western societies. I would also like to use this opportunity to thank the Austrian Cultural Forum in Belgrade for its support. Gabrielle, if you're ready, please start.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. And it's a pity I cannot be in Belgrade right now, but I hope times will change and we will meet some other time. So the question I want to start with is there still art, or is art absorbed by culture industry? Or to put it more precisely maybe, is art just a more sophisticated segment of the culture industry? So what leads me to pose this question is subject of this talk. So I will start with Adorno and Horkheimer's distinction between art and culture industry and reflect on the changes brought forward by neoliberal capitalism, which affect all areas of society, as well as the notion of the subject. So, of course, including art and artists. So I will first elaborate on what neoliberalism actually means. I will briefly refer to its theoretical foundations and sketch its basic ideas. I will then summarize its core strategies and socioeconomic consequences and its subject model, and give an idea of how neoliberalism has undermined democracy and paved the way to authoritarianism. And finally, I will ask for the implications of neoliberalism on art, artistic production, distribution, and consumption. So let me start by Adorno Horkheimer's distinction of art and culture industry. in the dialectic of enlightenment, they include a chapter, Culture Industry as Mass Deception. And culture industry here means not only cultural products as commodities, what is called Warenförmigkeit by Adorno and Horkheimer, but they mean a specific mode of socialization, the commodification of the mode of socialization. So what they refer to is a mode of social domination, integrating the individual in capitalistic societies. And primarily by providing standardized schemes of perception, which connect work and leisure and produce conformity. And in contrast to this notion of culture industry, art is based on autonomy. It reflects, it offers the chance to reflect, it offers critique, and it opens the chance of experience, which are not elements of the culture industry, quite the opposite. So what does neoliberalism mean based on this notion of art and culture industry today for the arts? So I want to explain first what neoliberalism actually means, and I do not agree with Professor Alexander as far as the term neoliberalism is concerned, because it's an analytical term which is well established in political science, in economics. Neoliberalism refers to the current formation of capitalism. So the current historical stage of capitalism is described by the term neoliberalism. So to differentiate the current period since the 1980s from Fordism. The Fordism is the capitalist formation which dominated from the 1920s to the late 1970s. Fordistic capitalism was based on the Keynesian welfare state. Keynesianism regarded the market as profoundly unstable and therefore promoted state intervention, and in particular, redistribution. Redistribution not as a means of social policy, but as a means of economic policy in order to provide stability to the market. So the Keynesian idea was to save capitalism from its own inherent crisis and failures. So of course we can observe a certain variety of neoliberalisms, but there are shared characteristics and there is a specific theoretical basis. So it's very clear what neoliberalism refers to. And in particular, since in 1989, the economist John Williams created the term Washington consensus to describe this neoliberal consensus which dominated US policies, which dominated the IMF, as the International Monetary Funds, and the World Bank policies, which implied that loans, financial support for developing countries in particular, were linked to a neoliberal program of reform. So this is one of the key tools neoliberalism was spread all over the world. Let's have a short look at the theoretical foundations. I just want to name 3 theorists in this context. First of all, I want to refer to Gary Becker. Gary Becker received the Nobel Memorial Prize for Economics in 1992. He died some years ago, but he was a very prominent voice in public discourse. And what he did seems really paradigmatic to me for neoliberal thought, because he extended the economic way of thinking, the economic analysis, and in particular, the economic decision-making model, which relies on calculation of costs and benefits. He extended this to all areas of human life and the subject. So everything becomes a market. All sectors of society are regarded as markets, and the subject is redefined in the context of what's called human capital theory. A theory Becker and others developed in the 1960s, in late 1960s, 1970s, and which basically means that the wage is a return on investment, a return on investment you take in human capital, in yourself. And this includes not only education or professional training or professional experience, but physical and mental health as a whole. So you can see how the subject is entirely its own economic unit and is subordinated to economic commodification and socialization. Hayek is the second theoretical frame I want to refer to. August Friedrich von Hayek was an Austrian economist who lived through the 20th century. He became very old, and he also received this Nobel Memorial Prize for Economics. His basic idea was that the market, it means a process of discovery. So what's essential for the market is the freedom of the individual. In order to secure this individual freedom, conformity is necessary. So conformity, and Hayek formulates this explicitly, conformity serves as a prerequisite of freedom in order not to make coercion necessary. So you can see that we all have to conform in order to be free. That's Hayek's idea. And furthermore, he also creates, implicitly at least, an elite theory, because the market as a process of discovery means that there are few, the most intelligent, the most skilled, the most talented, who are able to make these discoveries. There are few who are educated and talented, so they have the chance to discover something new and to bring the whole of society forward. So they lead somehow, and finally, the development they create will mean advantages for the whole society, for all of us. So this famous notion of trickling down, the progress which is made by the few will later be made by the mass of the people. And that's why he also is very skeptical and ambivalent about democracy, because freedom and democracy are in opposition to each other. At least that's his idea. Why? Because democracy means decision-making by the majority, which certainly can agree on restricting freedoms of this skilled, of this intelligent, of this educated minority. So democracy is always a threat to freedom. And he speaks of the tyranny of the majority with regards to democracy. So you can guess this very basic anti-democratic strife in Hayek's thought. And finally, I want to name Joseph Schumpeter, again an Austrian economist. It's somehow a little embarrassing that the Austrian School of Economics is so closely tied to neoliberalism. But Schumpeter created quite a similar idea a lot earlier than Hayek. In around about 1910, he published his theory on economic development. And he also has the idea of a force, an entrepreneurial force, which has the capacity to change a market, to change the development of an economy, to create the dynamics of an economy. This entrepreneur is closely linked to innovation. So entrepreneur finally means the person who is able to establish innovations. It's not so much the process of discovery here, but the establishment, the chance to assert innovations. And he calls this specific entrepreneur pioneer entrepreneur, an economic leader, an economic revolutionary. So you can see there are quite similar understandings concerning a small minority, either of people who are able to discover it, or entrepreneurs who are economic leaders. Both of them change somehow society's development, change the market, change the rules of the game, finally. So how were these theories finally put through? The program, the basic neoliberal program, was formulated in the context of Reagan's presidency. So what are the core strategies? Liberalization. Liberalization means reduction, limitation of market barriers, in particular international barriers, in order to promote trade, in order to free capital movements, which so this process of liberalization led to the creation of global markets and to the financialization of capitalism, to the dominance of the financial sector, which we experience nowadays. Liberalization, deregulation. Deregulation means not less regulation or less rules, but extension of the corporate scope of action, of the room for maneuver. And this extension of corporate room of maneuver referred in particular to the labor markets. In the labor market, deregulation meant the erosion of standard employment. Without, as a standard employment is employment without time limit, is full-time employment. Erosion of standard employment implies, of course, that there is a variety of forms of employment created. So there is growing atypical and precarious employment, which makes it difficult to create solidarity, which individualizes the workers and so on. Privatization is another important strategy. Privatization with regards to public ownership, but also public services. And finally, it extends to responsibility, public responsibility, political responsibility is replaced to a huge extent by personal responsibilities. So a move from the political sphere to the private sphere. The individual becomes responsible for his or her life, for unemployment, for example, for economic problems, which are not longer regarded as society's problems, but individualized. Another core strategy are tax cuts. Tax cuts in particular to corporations, tax on profits, tax on wealth, tax on inheritance. All these taxes were reduced, whereas, for example, value-added tax remained the same. So the progressive element, the redistributional element of the tax system was taken out, which resulted in redistribution not from the top to the bottom, but the other way, from the bottom to the top. And at the same time, tax cuts finally also meant an argument, offered an argument, were used as an argument for cutbacks of social benefits and social services, because tax cuts meant less public revenues. So the room for public expenses was reduced, and it was always the social sector which was which had to undergo such reductions. So these are the core neoliberal strategies, and at the same time, the state was redefined as a corporation. So business criteria became relevant for public action. And you can imagine, business is led by management. So also the state became somehow associated with this notion that it should be led by the best managers instead of elected political leaders, elected democratic bodies. So there is this, authoritarian drive with regards to this basic redefinition of the state, which was also accompanied by the redefinition of security, not social security was dominant any longer, but a militarized form of security. And I just want to remind you of this, of the war on terror since 9/11, and nowadays it's the war on the virus too. So militarization is a key element of this redefinition of the state. What were the consequences of all this? As I mentioned before, the dominance of the financial sector, the creation of global markets, the concentration of capital. Global players were created this way. Monopolies and oligopolies. So in contrast to what is usually associated with neoliberalism, that it means competition, for the corporate sector, for the global corporate sector, it means a reduction of competition. It means monopoly power in many cases, or let's say shared oligopolic power, which of course also implies the concentration of wealth, increasing profit rates and decreasing wage rates. With regards to the labor market, it meant precarious employment, self-employment, an enormous rise in unemployment, stagnation of real wages, widening of wage differentials, and huge low wage sector and a very small high wage sector, but growing differentials here. Intensification of work, externalization of entrepreneurship to the worker, of the entrepreneurial risk to the worker. So, for example, the hairstylist gets paid only a very small fixed amount and is, besides that, paid by the people he or she is working on, or the cleaners in hotels are paid by the number of rooms they clean every day. So if there are no rooms to be cleaned because the hotels are empty, it's their problem and not the hotel's owner's problem. So all these transformations in the labor market and the cutbacks in social transfers and social services meant, of course, increasing social insecurity, increasing unpaid labor, because whenever social services are cut back, the necessity of doing these services does not disappear, but it's shifted to the private realm of the household and results in mostly female unpaid labor. So you can see that neoliberalism meant a very basic shift in the relation between capital and labor, but also in gender relations and in racialized relations. Neoliberalism increased social inequality dramatically, led to enormous amount of social polarization and social divisions in society, which of course also implies exclusion, sexist and racist exclusion in particular. And as a further consequence, de-democratization with regards to the whole society, because all relations are made more unequal, more undemocratic. The whole, gaze of society is de-democratized, but also the political institutions, because the chances for lobbying, for informal decision-making beyond the democratic bodies have increased enormously. European integration also means increasing influence of corporations on politics, and international organizations like, for example, the World Trade Organization. So you can see the divisions in society were deepened, and the conditions for workers have deteriorated enormously. But at the same time, the so-called entrepreneurial self was promoted. This notion of the entrepreneur in all sectors of society, and particular, of course, in work. So what does this entrepreneurial self mean? It refers to self-management, self-presentation, self-marketing. So the worker is not just a worker, but an entrepreneur of him or herself, who always has to optimize him or herself, which of course also implies constant control, self-control, and self-rationalization. So this notion of the worker as an entrepreneur also was linked to flexibility, of course, and creativity. So all individual interests, all individual capacities became part of the job, were exploited and used in the work context. And this so-called creativity, this use of personal individuality was branded as personal fulfillment. So work as the major area of personal fulfillment, this was the notion which was created. Work at the same time became deregulated, and as such, short-term, project-oriented, always linked to changing relationships. So it's very difficult to build solidarity, to really get to know people and so on. And the promise behind that, of course, was the promise of economic success, which made it easy to undermine the separation of work and leisure, because the whole way of life became subject of economic utilization. So the entrepreneurial self means that the capitalist relation of domination was pushed to the interior of the subject. The subject is its own entrepreneur and its own commodity at the same time, has to sell him or herself as an entity. So the entire individual becomes object of exploitation. So in how far is this neoliberal sketch, or in how far is neoliberalism, as I sketched it, linked to authoritarianism. The basic idea of the market, of competition, which is not restricted, as I said, to the economy, but to all areas of life. Competition, of course, is a sort of civilized fight, a civilized war. And it's very close to social Darwinistic notions of the fight for survival. And I think within the context of COVID and this approach of herd immunity, you can observe how dominant social Darwinistic thinking has become. The competitor, on the other hand, and we are all competitors in this universal marketplace, is very close to the dichotomy of friend and foe. Friend and foe as the leading, let's say, political principle. The competitor is a civilized form of a warrior. And I mentioned before already the war on the virus, the war on terror, which are so present everywhere nowadays. Of course, the war is also prepared by a very profound militarization of society, which took place in the course of, maintaining security under or in the context of terror danger. And besides that, I just want to mention the new defense alliance, which is created within the European Union and which is called Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, which obliges all the member states to increase their military budgets, to increase the weapon, the buying of weapons and so on. So there are very clear numbers fixed, which should lead to a further development of a European, let's say, European military industrial complex. Competition, of course, implies competitiveness, assertiveness. And this is very close to notions of strength, toughness, and supremacy, in particular over the so-called other. So notions of the subject which are very characteristic for authoritarian contexts. And the flexibility and adaptability, which is related to competition, of course, also implies obedience. Work hierarchies always imply obedience. So this is quite the opposite of what a democracy fundamentally should mean. And I just want to mention that this model of competition of the competitor is an implicit masculine model. It's not, it relies on the attributes of masculinity in modernity. But this implicit masculinity becomes much more explicit, in particular in the context of war. So this is another shift which really seems very basic to me with regards to relations, human relations in society. At the same time, I mean, accompanying this very general subject model, there is the notion of an elite, of economic leaders, of economic revolutionaries, of innovators. All these ideas derived from Hayek and Schumpeter. And these revolutionaries or leaders, they shape the economic development. So what's true for the mass of the people, the competition, all the qualities they have to prove, is not really relevant for this elite, which is above all. So you can see this basic division in society, which is created. So the social divisions, the social inequality, which characterizes neoliberalism, of course, has a lot of destructive consequences. And in order to compensate these destructive consequences, one main idea is community instead of society. So in German, there are these words Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, community, Gemeinschaft, society, Gesellschaft. Very, very different notions, because community is based on personal close relations, and these are created, or at least it's tried to create them, by nationalism. So nationalism serves as a mode of integration in this very dangerous for in this dangerous competition, dangerous with regards to the cohesion of society. So neoliberalism creates the ground for authoritarianism by creating social inequality and social divisions, which can be rationalized and can be engendered. And they also provide the psychological basis, because insecurity, of course, is connected with anxiety, frustration, permanent pressure. And as a result, produces what Adorno, for example, called the authoritarian personality, which explains why white supremacy, why sexism and misogyny become increasingly established again. I don't mean that they have disappeared, but that they are expanding that much. So you can see we have the social prerequisites, we have the psychological prerequisites, and we have, although I could not explain that in detail, the institutional prerequisites, the democratization of the state. What does this mean for art? What is left of art? Just to remember, art is, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, based on autonomy and offers reflection, critique, and the chance of experience. is there autonomy in this context? In the context of this entrepreneurial self? If the art world is part of the market, and certainly it is, it's clear that commodification accompanies this. And what is really commodified here is probably not only the artwork, but the artist. It's self-commodification, which is somehow required here. The artist serves as the brand, not the work he or she does. And to create brands offers the chance to limit the scope of the market, because the market basically needs scarcity. Markets are based on the principle of scarcity. If there is no scarcity, there is no market. So you have to create scarcity in a certain way. And I think this is created by the reliance on the artist instead of the artwork. So the artist serves as an entrepreneur, determined not by his or her work, but by his or her economic success, which of course all undermines the notion of autonomy. What's about reflection, critique, experience? Let's think about who buys art in the neoliberal context. It's capital, in particular finance capital. So it's private collectors or private institutions, private enterprises. In many cases, public institutions, public museums, for example, cannot compete because they do not have, with these private collectors, because they do not have the funds, simply. And if there is a public interest, or if there is a public institution buying art, it's often driven by the profit motive. For example, because tourism or art plays a crucial role for tourism. So again, the business logic has become more and more dominant in the public sector. So this, of course, means that the logic of selection does not differ very much from private institutions, the logic of selection in the public sector. So what's related to this kind of art markets is that it's not experience that counts, but it's consumption. Art becomes a signifier of social rank. It is based on exclusion. I mean, just think of, for example, free ports, which are parts of airports, which are regarded as international space, and a lot of art objects are stored in these free ports because they do not have, if the art remains within these free ports, you do not have to pay taxes. So art serves as an object of investment and speculation in many cases. And it's not about, public access to art. And finally, I want to mention the conditions of production, of artistic production, the living conditions of course, all the social insecurity, the low wages applies to the artistic production, to the life of artists too. And in particular, it applies to the life of artists. So together with, rising real estate prices, rising studio rents, less public studios, and so on, the living conditions for artists become more and more difficult. So the chance to gain some sort of autonomy and not to adapt to the market principles and the wishes or the tastes of private collectors, of the buyers of finance capital. It's very difficult. So what is the room of reflection, of critique, and the chance of experience in this context? I think it's understandable that adaptation is easier and more frequent than a very long and maybe bitter fight for autonomy. So just to finish, I want to pose this question again. Is there still art, or is art absorbed by culture industry? And is art just a segment of the culture industry? Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. We have some time for questions, and there are some in the chat. Would you like me to read it?
Yes, please. Would make it easier for me.
Okay. The first one is, would it be possible to organize an artistic or cultural organization that wouldn't be organized on the basis on the neoliberal values, such as competitiveness, but solidarity and equity in the neoliberal world? And if yes, how?
Well, I think, of course, basically everything is possible, but the conditions for organizing, for self-organization, let's say, are very severe. Where do the resources come from? Who has the time, free time, really, to get engaged? So I think, although there are, let's say, these rather deteriorating, materially deteriorating conditions. Of course, on the other hand, the pressure the individual is exposed to is increasing. And I think these are contradicting forces, which of course make it somehow, at the same time and despite all this, not only possible but also probable that there is some extent of self-organization in order, based on solidarity, in order to become more independent from the system. So it's always, this dialectics, I think. And how to do this, I really don't know. I mean, I think what seems important to me as a political economist is that we do not give up this model of cooperation, of cooperatives, and that they are pushed forward in public discourse as an alternative to this sort of, disciplinary administration of unemployed, for example. So to open the space for different public support for alternative forms of dealing with very, very profound current problems like unemployment, for example.
Okay, and we have more questions from Vishnia. Vishnia, would you like me to read it, or if
yeah, I can also ask them. Thank you for a really inspiring and thoughtful lecture. It was a great journey of understanding neoliberalism. You mentioned really well, or explained really well, how we can observe neoliberalism, or how we have to observe neoliberalism as a new face of capitalism. But I would also like to hear from you this kind of global perspective on how we could read neoliberalism as part of neocolonialism, so that basically colonialism hasn't diminished, but through the World Bank, through all those institutions that you have been mentioning, so how this specific governmentality works in relationships between the states in the world.
Big question, of course, very important question. Yeah, I think that the notion of globalization is really misleading, because it's not a globalization where every country or all citizens can take part in the same way. I mean, it's very clear. I would rather call it neo-colonialism. And I think there are two main points here. Of course, many, many aspects, but two main points is globalization offering the chance for the global North or the Western societies to exploit the resources, the natural resources of the global South in a much cheaper and easier way, because capital can move freely, because free trade is the paradigm of exchange and so on. But of course, free trade is not really free trade. It's trade according to the rules set by the Western Hemisphere. It's, globalization, or what is called globalization, actually means to secure the natural resources of the global South, and as far as it is needed, the work capacity of the global South. I mean, we import workers, in particular for the care sector, very cheap labor, which is needed in our societies because nobody wants to pay for care work. So we import very cheap labor and move workers more or less the way we want. I mean, there are specific flows of workers which we enforce. By we, I mean Western, let's say the European Union. For example, providing ways of migration to the European Union, in particular for women working in the care for the elderly, or as cleaners in the private households and so on. And on the other hand, we try to keep all the workers out who do not fit, our necessities in this sense. So I think globalization or neoliberal globalization means drawing on the natural resources and the human resources of the global south, according to our in a flexible way, according to our immediate needs, let's say.
Yeah, thank you. I think also what you kind of drew really well, this kind of relationship or kind of, troubled relationship between the kind of freedom-loving kind of neoliberal system and the authoritarian regimes, militarization and so on, that it imposes, that it's so readable in the global south, in the relationship between the north and the south for 20 years already, even though it has come kind of, it came home recently in Europe and in Western societies for us to kind of notice it. But I think those who are living in Africa or Middle East or Latin America have had exactly these experiences.
Yeah, actually, in Western countries too. I mean, in the United States, about half of the population is lives
živi ispod linije siromaštva, u visokom riziku od siromaštva. Milioni ljudi sada zavise od banaka hrane.
In one of the richest countries, actually. And at the same time, there are billions and billions spent on war by the US. I mean, more than 700 billions officially, designated in the budget to the military sector. So, I mean, not including all other forms of expenses, which are more indirectly related to that. So, I mean, there is an enormous inequality in distribution, and there are very little signs that the political system really reacts to that. And I think this notion that it's a handful of people, probably 8 people, if Oxfam is correct, 8 people own as much as the bottom half of humankind. I mean, what kind of system is this? And yeah, I mean, of course, we could talk about this and without ends, but I think it's important to realize just one aspect, that the militarization of the state, of course, is not only targeting, the foe somewhere outside, but it's also inside. I think this is much more critical. All these bourgeois freedoms, the basic civic freedoms, for example, that you cannot be arrested if you have not committed, or at least are, so let's say, accused of having committed something, but that you can be arrested just because you have a certain ideological preference, because you are endangering society, that you might be a terrorist.
Can I make a comment here?
Yes, please.
2 comments actually. from Helsinki, Finland, and from the Nordic perspective. First of all, just as a notion that I think in the Finnish context, we try to avoid using the term neoliberalism, because it gives the impression of being linked to some kind of freedom, even though from our social democratic viewpoint it's the opposite of freedom. So we use terms like hard capitalism, or in some other circumstances consumer capitalism, or whatever. So we try to avoid the term. I don't think that others should, but just as a basic information to you all. Then about the relationship between art and markets, and can the art still survive in these circumstances? I'm afraid of the threats, but on the other hand, in our context here, you could also say that art is only partly in the markets, in the sense that, for example, there are 3,000 visual artists in Finland, and all of them are constantly making art and exhibiting and so on and so forth. And only a handful of them get their main income from the sales of their artworks. So they are not really significant players in the commercial art market. Their income comes from grants or copyright royalties, or from teaching, or having a rich husband, or another job. And the same goes for literature, that there are about 700 writers and only a handful gets significant income from sales of the books, but still all of them keep writing and publishing. And because of this, I think it makes sense to point out that in our context, artists and art constitute a kind of public good, or common pool good, that it's available for everybody, and it's funded in various ways, and market-driven funding is only a small slice of that funding. And in a way, this is problematic, because artists tend to be fairly poor economically here, but on the other hand, we are relatively safe from the ruthless forces of the markets. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for maybe just one more question. I don't know if Anya or Vita would like to ask, or I can also read it.
Yes, let me just check. Okay, there I am. Hi. Thank you for this lecture. There was just one small note about when you spoke about museum acquisitions and the logic of the selection of the public sector. I would tend to agree, of course. It's just that we know that there are some examples of, and of course that state institutions cannot compete with private collectors and banks and other big collections. But fortunately, there have been some shifts in the interest of some museums expanding their collections into broader geographical areas. And there has been an interest in art from the Middle East and Eastern Europe and kind of the global South, which is not exactly the logic of acquiring works for tourism purposes and kind of getting more audiences, but it's really like to finally introduce these regions into the art historical canon of the museum collection. So I would just like your opinion about that aspect as well.
Well, actually, of course, I agree with you, and I think the system still is not that totalitarian, you know. So, of course, there are still rooms, and the transformation of the welfare state in a purely marketplace is not 100% realized yet, and probably never will be realized fully, because it will undermine the state and will endanger the whole of society. But what came to my mind when you spoke was that the arts of the global south, of Eastern Europe, are easier to acquire somehow, because they do not, in general, I mean, it's a field of arts which is not that known in Western Europe, in huge parts of the European Union somehow. And it seems to me, but I'm not a specialist on this, that it's somehow cheaper and easier to introduce something new in this context. So I think it's also partly maybe out of necessity to somehow find ways to cope with the dilemma of very limited funding.
Well, yes and no, in the sense that there are some, I mean, mainly for East Europe, it's a bit different for the Middle East. For the Middle East, it's more really contemporary works. But when we talk about museum acquisitions of Eastern Europe, it's usually the avant-garde artists that are now being bought, and they have already like good pricing. I mean, it's not so much cheaper than the Western counterpart. So I don't know if it's about being cheaper, but I would just like to be optimistic in this sense and think that there are some Western institutions that are kind of expanding their portfolios, their collections to acquire other works of art, and are not thinking only about blockbuster exhibitions, but rather really being more inclusive collections and not only Western artworks. That's all.
Yeah, actually, I really don't know enough about the art market to really answer your question in a competent way. I just wanted to share the thought I had when you talked about this, but I really don't know.
No, well, I do agree when you said the logic of selection is, you know, one which mainly that I just wanted to from some kind of own knowledge, because this is what I looked into, mainly Middle East and East Europe, that it's still there is a small hope and there's a small fortune side that there are museum acquisitions that are not only based on the logic of the audience.
No, sure, I agree with you on that. But basically, I think, you know, this discourse on returning objects from colonialism, for example, to the countries where they have been taken from. I think it does not mean that let's say the Western societies are less are acting in a less colonialist way. You know, it's a very symbolic discourse. It has little effects up to now, but in particular, it makes it easy to say we have overcome colonialism, and colonialism refers to something in the past. But the way economic relations are shaped currently is excluded from this perspective. I think this is maybe somehow a little bit of a further frame for the question you pose.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you, Gabrielle, for this very thoughtful and important lecture. Looking forward to see you in person in Belgrade maybe next year.
I
And
hope so.
I would like to invite all of you to a short break, 5 minutes break, and then we will continue with a panel session on democratization of art, historical method.
I want to thank you for the invitation and say bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.